What if the tree of life isn't a tree? David Quammen will be here to talk about his new book, The Tangled Tree, A Radical New History of Life. Should a public school be run like a business? Andrea Gabor will be here to talk about After the Education Wars. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. David Quammen joins us now from his home office in Bozeman, Montana. His new book is called The Tangled Tree, A Radical New History of Life. David, thanks so much for being here.
Pamela, great pleasure to talk with you.
So let's start with the title. What is the tangled tree, or what was the tree before it got tangled?
The untangled tree was the conventional tree of life. The tree of life is a trope, an image that goes back deep in time, back to the book of Revelation, where it was sort of a religious symbol. But beginning with Darwin, it was the image of the evolutionary history of life on Earth. Darwin himself suggested the tree as the graphic image of the way life has arisen from a single origin, diverged, diversified, changed over time, descent with modification, branched apart, and resulted in the diversity of life on Earth as we see it, the diversity being all the twigs and the branches and the canopy of the tree.
That idea began as a very controversial one. It's no longer, at least among most people, a controversy at all. And yet what you're saying in this book is that it's also not quite accurate.
Right. The tree of life as the history of evolution is only controversial now in the sense that it's a rearguard orthodoxy. And beginning in the work of my central character, Carl Woese, in the 1970s, but particularly in the 1990s, early 2000s, scientists made some boggling discoveries that revealed to them, among other things, that the tree of life is not a tree. It is a tangled, contorted, web-like, net-like intermingling of events, crossovers, and convergence as well as divergence of lineages.
The bush of life doesn't have the same ring.
The bush of life doesn't get it either because limbs on a bush don't converge. In the wild, no plant has limbs or branches that grow into one another. And that's what's missing because of this phenomenon I described that the scientists call horizontal gene transfer, genes moving sideways, limbs and branches that converge with other limbs and branches.
Let's go back to Carl Woese and talk about what it is that he discovered that transformed our understanding of these branches.
He began this revolution. November 3rd, 1977, he was on the front page of the Times, above the fold. A picture of him and a story about his discovery of what was being called a third kingdom of life on Earth. It was thought that there were only two major kingdoms. One was essentially all bacteria, living cells without cell nuclei, without complexity. And the other kingdom was everything else, called eukaryotes, cells with nuclei, meaning humans, animals of all sorts, fungi, plants, complex creatures. And Woese came along and said, wait, I've found a third kingdom, things that look like bacteria, but are not bacteria if you examine their genomes, because their genomes more closely resemble complex creatures, more closely resemble eukaryotes, more closely resemble humans than they do bacteria. And these things came to be called the archaea, the third great kingdom or domain of life. That was the start for Woese. That was his 15 minutes of Andy Warhol fame, front page of the Times.
You knew to say that it was above the fold, which I like. a distinction here. And
that led to other people adopting his methods, which was early, primitive, laborious gene sequencing of RNA first and then DNA, that allowed him to compare creatures based on their genome.
Okay, so most people can look around and they say, oh, this is a bacteria. I can see it under a microscope. This is everything else that's not a bacteria. What is this third thing, archaea? Where do you find it?
under a microscope, they would look like bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at their genomes, they're completely different from bacteria. They live in the kind of places where bacteria live, except generally in the most extreme places. They live in very salty environments. They live in environments with no oxygen. They live in acidic environments. They live in the hot springs of Yellowstone Park, just down the road from where I am here. So they were called extremophiles, lovers of extremity in all environmental forms. Now it's known that they live in a lot of other places too, but at the time Mohs made his discovery, they were thought of as these extreme creatures looking like bacteria but living in these impossible environments.
How did he find them?
Well, he started looking at bacteria because he wanted to understand the earliest history of life. So he started comparing one kind of bacterium to another to see what was related to what. He had a particular gene that he was looking at that was very, very basic to all forms of life, because it's a gene that helps translate genetic information into living bodies. So he was looking at these bacteria, and he decided, well, let's look at this one group of bacteria that come from sewage in Urbana, Illinois, and they create methane. They metabolize carbon dioxide. They live without oxygen. They were called the methanogens, methane creators. And he looked at their genome, and he walked into the office of a friend of his, Ralph Wolf, who was a world expert on these creatures, the methanogens. And after having seen their genomes, he said, Wolf, these things aren't even bacteria. And that was the beginning of the discovery that ended up on the front page of the Times.
How do we get from that discovery to this idea of horizontal gene transfer?
That happened as genome sequencing became more and more effective, more and more easy, fast, inexpensive, and people started sequencing whole genomes of all kinds of creatures, all kinds of bacteria, all kinds of archaea, of yeast, very simple eukaryotic creature, and then fruit flies, and eventually the Human Genome Project in 2000, 2001. And so they had all of these complete genomes, and they had powerful computers that allowed them to compare for instance, the 3 billion letters of the human genome with other genomes. And they started seeing anomalies. They started seeing genes that shouldn't have been where they were. For instance, they might see a gene in a species of butterfly and find that it looked like a bacterial gene, but it was missing in all the other species of butterfly within that family of butterflies. So it was missing from the ancestor, the butterfly ancestor. It had gotten in somehow from a bacterium. And the somehow is what's now called horizontal gene transfer.
To bring this message home to our human listeners, how does this function in people?
Well, for the most dramatic instance, I suppose, is the fact that 8% of the human genome, we now know, is viral DNA. It's DNA that has gotten into our genomes by sideways transfer, by infection. It comes from retroviruses that have infected the animal lineage over millions of years, but haven't come down directly, this DNA, from deep animal ancestors. Instead, it has come sideways by infection carried in by retroviruses. Now, a retrovirus, if it infects an immune cell, it's called retro because it transfers its DNA backwards into the cell it infects, HIV, for instance. But if it infects reproductive cells, germ cells, eggs, sperm, ovaries, testes, then inserting its DNA into those cells can make it hereditary, heritable. And that's what's happened. 8% of our genome has come in sideways by viral infection from retroviruses that have embedded their DNA in our reproductive cells.
One of my favorite fun facts, which I'm probably going to explain here in an oversimplified and lightly incorrect way, is that when you are pregnant, some of your fetus's cells will often break off and enter into the mother's body and stay there even after birth, so that you are, as a mother, literally carrying parts of your child within you, and that when you get sick with an infection, let's say a virus infects you, that it is often those cells, those I don't know if they're stem cells, but those cells from your fetus are the first ones to attack. And that at some level, many mothers who have these cells are chimera. It sounds like this research is showing at a very deep genetic level, we're all sort of chimera.
That's absolutely right. That's the right word. I say mosaics sometimes, but chimera. Yes, we are chimera. We are composites of various creatures, various bits of DNA. We contain bacterial DNA captured within our cells and turned into organelles that help our cells package energy. We contain this 8% of viral DNA. We are mosaics. We are chimera. Speaking of pregnancy and the fetus, there is a membrane between the placenta and the fetus in human pregnancy, all mammalian pregnancy. And that membrane is created by a gene that we have acquired by viral infection. It's one of these internalized retrovirus genes. Pregnancy would be impossible without that viral gene.
Obviously, we're talking about evolution very, very early on. If we couldn't breed without this virus attack. This idea that 8% of the human genome is formed of sort of non-human viral matter or retroviral, that sounds like very big news. When did we discover that, and why isn't that on the top fold of the New York Times front page?
The scientists discovered it beginning in about 1999, 2000, 2001, 2005. There were a couple of different scientific teams that made these discoveries. One of them is led by a French scientist named Thierry Heidemann, based at an institute south of Paris. I spoke with him at some length about his work on this, and that's part of the book. Matter of fact, I emailed him. I started reading his work, and it was so boggling to me, and this was near the end of my research, that I emailed him and said, if I come to Paris, will you talk to me for an hour? And he said, sure, yes, of course. So I flew to Paris just for that reason, and he picked me up at my hotel. We drove through the city on the world's most elegant commute to his institute, and then we talked for 7 hours about his work. It is completely astonishing, boggling. It hasn't been in the public eye yet. It's not well known because it's connected to a lot of very complicated things that haven't been written about much or at all for the general public. I mean, beginning with Carl Woese. How many people have heard of Carl? Have you ever heard of Carl Woese before?
I've never heard of Carl Woese.
Okay, there we go. He is, and I even talked to evolutionary biologists who have never heard of Carl Woese. That's why I call him the most important biologist of the 20th century that you've never heard of.
He's not the only scientist that you focus on in the book. Tell us about Lynn Margulis.
Oh, Lynn Margulis was a wonderful figure, and it was a pleasure and a privilege to write about her. She died a few years ago. I met her right before she died. She was a microbiologist, bright, confident, and outrageous, educated at the University of Chicago, who in 1967 published a paper that had been rejected by about 15 scientific journals, finally published it, proposing the theory that she called endosymbiosis. Endosymbiosis is essentially the idea that, I mentioned this earlier, our cells, complex cells, contain organelles, internal organs, that have evolved from captured bacteria that were captured by the progenitors of our cells, maybe a billion or 1.5 billion years ago. There were other parts of her theory, but essentially it was the theory that we are chimeras, that we are mosaics containing bacterial DNA, plants also containing bacterial DNA that has become their chloroplasts that allow them to photosynthesize. People thought Lynn Margulis was crazy, was wacky, but eventually other scientists using the methods of Carl Woese confirmed using DNA that she was right about this.
Her work was ignored at first or laughed at or disregarded. Carl Woese's work didn't completely transform the world immediately. Is there a reason why the scientific community would be resistant to these ideas?
A couple of reasons. One is that they are deeply counterintuitive. They go against orthodoxy. They go against the orthodox tree of life. Some of Woese's ideas go against the classic Darwinian theory of evolution that includes ideas such as evolution always being very gradual, based on incremental mutations. That's where the innovation that natural selection works on comes from, it was thought. But horizontal gene transfer shows that innovation can arrive in a lineage in a big lump very suddenly. So there were these various different things that went against neo-Darwinism, orthodox Darwinian thinking. And there was resistance to that. And there should have been resistance to that because you can't change your scientific theories every time somebody proposes some sort of a wacky new theory. But over time, those ideas have been confirmed with more and more evidence of more and more different kinds. And now Wose's three-branch base of the tree of life is accepted, and so is most parts of Margulis's endosymbiosis theory.
Does horizontal gene transfer confer some kind of advantage on the people and the plants, the other animals in which this operates?
It does, because it brings, as I said, large packets of innovation into lineages. Now, sometimes that means the end of the line, like a mutation can mean the death of an individual and the end of a species. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's very advantageous. For instance, I mentioned the ability for mammals to have internal pregnancy with a placenta and a fetus. That's one of the advantages that we have that, for instance, birds don't have, and it has come to us by sideways transfer from these retroviruses.
I want to bring up one other scientist whom you discuss in the book, Tsutomu Watanabe.
Yes.
Tell us about him and his contribution.
Wonderful researcher in Japan in the early 1960s, and he and his colleagues, Watanabe and his colleagues, were the first to announce from their research that antibiotic resistance, the resistance to antibiotics among bacteria, what we now sometimes call killer bacteria, this is transferred instantly from one kind of bacterium to another, one species, one family of bacterium to another by horizontal gene transfer. We hear a lot about the problem of antibiotic-resistant bacteria now, MRSA and the other forms that kill thousands of people a year. But what we don't hear is that the reason that problem is spreading around the planet so quickly is not because of incremental evolution in the different strains of bacteria, but because once they have evolved a resistance, they can pass it to another kind of bacteria instantly by horizontal gene transfer. That was Watanabe's contribution.
Now that we know, and presumably this is now accepted among scientists, this notion of the tangled tree, what are the other important implications today?
Well, one important implication is to shed light on the argument over genetic engineering, genetically modified organisms, germline engineering, technologies such as CRISPR, very controversial because with CRISPR, for instance, we can precisely edit genomes, even soon, no doubt, in humans. And some people say, oh, this genetic engineering, genetically modifying organisms, it's very unnatural. It's going to lead to monstrous results. Well, it may lead to some monstrous results. It may lead to some very good health dividends. But the gloss coming from Wose and from my book, I hope, is that this sort of thing has been going on for 3 billion years or more. Movement of genes sideways genetic modification is absolutely natural. It's a natural phenomenon. So that makes it a little trickier to condemn what we're doing in the laboratories as unnatural.
I'm going to cling on to the placenta fact as my sort of favorite example of horizontal gene transfer. What most surprised you in researching the book in terms of an example of how this works in practice?
Well, both of those two. This membrane between the placenta and the fetus, which has got a fancy name, syncytiotrophoblaст, and the implications for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. But I first heard about horizontal gene transfer, first read about it back in 2013. I had not heard of it before that. And the very fact of that is probably what amazed me most and started me on the route toward this book. As late as 2013, I was saying, what? Horizontal gene transfer? No, that's not possible. And the more I read, the more I realized that it was possible, it was widespread, and it was very significant for our understanding, not just of our own identities, but of the history of life on Earth.
David, thanks so much. Plenty to mull over here.
Thank you, Pamela. I enjoyed it.
David Quammen's new book is called The Tangled Tree, A Radical New History of Life. You know Quammen's work from his previous books, The Song of the Dodo, The Reluctant Mr. Darwin, and Spillover, among many others. David, thank you again.
Thank you, Pamela. I really appreciate it.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Andrea Gabor joins us now. She is the Bloomberg Chair of Business Journalism at Baruch College, which is part of CUNY, and a former staff writer and editor at U.S. News and World Report and Business Week. Her new book is called After the Education Wars, How Smart Schools Upend the Business of Reform. Andrea, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
All right. So the obvious question is, you're a business journalist. Why did you decide to write a book about education?
Because business became interested in education. So I was commissioned to write an article about the New York City Principals Leadership Academy, which at the start of the Bloomberg administration was tasked with helping to train 600 new principals for these small schools that the administration wanted to found. And it was modeled in part on the General Electric Leadership Academy in Crotonville, New York. And I went to one of the first training sessions, and there was Jack Welch, the former CEO, once known as Neutron Jack. And I started thinking, well, what can Neutron Jack teach educators, and how will those lessons be received? So that's really sort of how I got interested.
It's interesting because there used to be this program, I don't know if it still exists, called Principal for a Day, where a nonprofit organization, I think, organized leaders from around New York City's community and business and elsewhere to kind of come in and, quote unquote, be a principal for a day. And I think the idea was obviously to get sort of the business sector and other parties interested in and have a stake in education and perhaps offer lessons. So this is kind of an expansion in a way, too, of that idea that principals can learn something from the outside world, and in this case, specifically from the business world.
Well, and I think it's much more concentrated and organized than that. So 35 years ago, A Nation at Risk was published, and it sounded this alarm about the state of American education. And American business became very interested in that. And of course, the philanthropies, especially the big three, Gates, Walton, and the Broad Foundation, have quadrupled their spending on education. And the idea is not just that business should be interested and should help fund, which is an old idea that foundations, for example, have long done, but it's actually that we can learn lessons from how businesses are run. And the irony, and one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, is that they adopted, in my view, all of the wrong lessons from the business world. They adopted the old 1980s top-down, hierarchical, command and control, carrot and stick approaches.
Right, with very results-oriented, right?
Very short-term results-oriented,
it's
i.e.
like
test scores.
Quarterly results.
Exactly.
Even in that very premise that you can run a school without having any background in education is maybe not a good idea?
No, it's not a very good idea. And in fact, one of the tragedies really of the Bloomberg administration was that here in New York, you actually had a very deep bench of sophisticated educators. Remember, back in the 1970s, you had Debbie Meyer, the first educator who won a MacArthur Award, Tony Alvarado, who was the superintendent of District 4 in Harlem, later became briefly the chancellor, and they sparked the small schools revolution back in the 70s and 80s, and it was actually very successful. And so what Bloomberg does when he comes to office is he actually recognizes this group of innovative educators. He adopts the small school strategy. He adopts the idea that you want to break up the big high schools and put in a bunch of small schools. He adopts, again from Alvarado, the idea that you want to train principals, that training is really key to this whole idea of school improvement. But he doesn't entirely, and by he, I mean Joel Klein, his chancellor, the administrator, they don't really trust educators. They're these scrappy, scruffy, hippies, right, versus Harvard and Wharton-trained MBAs. And time again, they put a business guy or gal in charge who doesn't know what they're doing, and it becomes a real problem. So that's what happened with the Leadership Academy. They had the head of a failed telecommunications company run the Leadership Academy before they finally turned it over to the very highly respected woman who had been running principal training for Tony Alvarado for years. The same thing happened when Kathy Black was appointed, which always mystified me.
The former head of Hearst Publications.
Yes. And again, no education background. And this was after Joel Klein had been the chancellor for 8 years. And regardless of what you might think of Joel Klein, he had, again, all these lieutenants, some of whom, Eric Nailstern in particular, who again traces his roots all the way back to Debbie Meyer and the small schools movement and Tony Alvarado. You had this deep bench of very experienced people. And what does Bloomberg do? He brings in this totally inexperienced business gal. Go figure.
So let's talk about what some of the wrong lessons from the business world that were applied to schools and what was wrong about them.
So as I mentioned, it's this very top-down hierarchical command and control. So a little bit of business history, as you'll recall, back in the 80s, American industry was flat on its back. The Japanese were beating our pants off in Detroit, in the consumer electronics industry, you name it. And American industry discovered a man by the name of W. Edwards Deming, a quality guru, and he was actually the subject of my first book. So Deming and a group of sort of systems thinkers really got the world thinking about a different way of managing, flatter organizations, much more collaborative. The idea being that the people closest to a process, whether in the car industry, that would be the factory workers, in a school, it would be teachers, maybe even kids, who really understand what's going on with the process, what the problems are, and what the potential opportunities for improvement. And Deming's great insight was that the best way to improve quality is to sort of unlock this knowledge that exists very close to the process. But the only way you can do that, he argued, was if you have trust. Okay, if you really build trust with your employees so that they can surface problems, take risks, et cetera. And this is
all this sounds great.
This sounds great, right? But it was very antithetical to the way a lot of American businesses thought. And in fact, Detroit didn't start listening to Deming until it was really almost too late, until Ford was almost in bankruptcy. They were losing billions of dollars. And, even then, his star was relatively short-lived in the U.S. because it was really different. I mean, think about, if we go back to Neutron Jack at General Electric, he too adopted some of these quality ideas, but he adopted all of the data pieces, didn't want anything to do with the humanistic pieces. And when you think about education, schools are a completely different cultural environment. These are places that are about nurturing and teaching and bringing along children, right? And so the idea that you can run them like a business and do the command and control thing and not trust teachers just doesn't wash.
Because what's the product, really, in a school? What's the equivalent of a product? Is it the test result? Is it the high school graduation rate? Like, how do they determine sort of what the outcome is supposed to be, and how do you quantify that?
Ever since No Child Left Behind under Bush, the main output was seen as test scores. And now we're saying, we need broader metrics, so we're looking at graduation rates, and we're not looking enough at dropout rates. But the point is, the output is really children, okay, or should be children.
What is the time period that you're describing in this book? Because the No Child Left Behind obviously was 2000 to 2008 Bush era policy, which was then continued
under Obama.
Under Obama.
Absolutely. So we're really talking about a continuum, and it really goes back to probably, I think, 25 years is really the great shift, because it starts with the states. Remember, before President Bush, we had Governor Bush in Texas, and he really starts that whole kind of test-driven approach to reform. And in also 1993, you have a whole bunch of states, including Massachusetts and Michigan, that start these ed reform movements, some of which are much more successful, i.e. Massachusetts, and others much less successful, i.e. Michigan. But, as long as we're talking about Bush, I'd love to just mention briefly one of the examples in my book is this district that I suspect most of our listeners will never have heard of called Leander, Texas. Mm-hmm. Which started off as a small, fairly mediocre district. And it's actually the first district in the country that consciously embraced sort of Deming's ideas of collaborative, trust-based, continuous improvement, if you will. And they pursued that process for over 30 years with amazing results. That district is now almost the size of New Orleans. And it was really a complete cultural shift. And one of the things that enabled that shift was that early on, just as this test-based accountability was ratcheting up in Texas, they won an exemption from strict teacher evaluations based on test scores. Mm-hmm. They were able to extend that exemption over the course of years. So while the rest of Texas is madly pursuing test scores and teachers are freaking out about their ratings, and remember, it's a right-to-work state, so no union protections, Leander is just continuing with its strategies. The teachers are working together. The district is working together. Schools are learning from each other. And it's a pretty amazing transformation story.
Well, it's interesting then that we were talking about the genesis of this in Texas, which does not have labor union protection, because one of the frustrations that you'll often hear from people who've worked in the private sector about public education is that you can't just go and fire your employees, right? That you can hold them accountable, but then what if they don't, quote unquote, perform? If the teachers who are the employees do not create the product, which is the test scores and the children, what do you do?
Okay. Well, we started out talking about Texas, one district, right? But really, the best example of improvement in this country is Massachusetts, which is one of the most unionized states out there. And two things that are really notable about Massachusetts is that it's a bipartisan reform. Mm-hmm. They spend about 5 years really cementing it. So they introduce an exit exam requirement, basically the 10th grade MCAS test, which is really quite difficult. Mm-hmm. But they give the kids a number of years to get used to taking the test before it actually counts. The test is transparent. Teachers are part of an iterative process of improving that test. The entire reforms were done collaboratively with politicians, teachers, parents, communities. So it was a very collaborative process. Took a while to cement. And it really worked for a number of years. Massachusetts became number one. And one of the places that I looked at very closely—
Number one in terms
of NAEP scores, which is it's called the nation's report card. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you look at international scores, Massachusetts is right up there with the top Asian countries. So one of the places that I looked at very closely was Brockton High, which was the largest, poorest high school in Massachusetts.
Where is this?
It's outside Boston, and really a struggling school, especially after all these budget cuts. Because remember, part of the reason that the Massachusetts ed reforms happened is that a big feature of that was over $1 billion in extra funding in exchange for more accountability. So the schools in Massachusetts had really been starved, and part of this was the grand bargain of providing more funding. And incidentally, Massachusetts now once again facing the problem of schools being underfunded and are debating another grand bargain. But in any event, going back to Brockton, really huge problems. And there again, things were so bad that the district basically led a group of teachers who said, we have an idea, let us run with it. And they started this literacy strategy. And they ran with that literacy strategy for almost 20 years. And Brockton went from being one of the worst high schools in Massachusetts to being one of the best. And it remains a very poor district, mostly kids of color, lots mm-hmm. of kids who don't come in speaking English because they come from Haiti and Cape Verde. And another great example of where a very systematic approach to improvement with a lot of grassroots collaboration made a huge difference.
Despite these success stories, it's not as if education is suddenly working across the country, even in a majority of school districts. When you say after the education wars, what is the after? Is that in the future? Is that now? Is that sometime in the past? It feels like we're still in the education wars.
Well, yes, we are still in the midst of the education wars. But I think we're at an inflection point right now. We have seen 20 years of test-based accountability take us nowhere. You know, the NAEP scores, the Nations Report Card have remained flat for 20 years. And incidentally, it's not that our education system is doing so terribly. There are many districts in the country that are doing very well. It's where we haven't succeeded is bringing the really poor districts up to par.
When you say that the test scores have remained flat, has spending increased during that same period on a per-student basis? Spending
has increased in some places, but then again, it's been stripped away. So you can't think of it as a straight curve, and it's different in different parts of the country, right? So you can't really compare Massachusetts to Louisiana, but Massachusetts is a great example. They literally doubled the amount of spending in 1993 for the poorest districts in Massachusetts. And they maintained that spending for about a decade. And then tax cuts, economic downturns, et cetera, and that spending began to be whittled away. And actually, the Massachusetts State Senate just released a report saying that they were almost back to where they started in 1993 and really needed to up the spending. So it's really hard to think of this. But no, we really don't as a country invest in education. I would say that's the bottom line.
Because you will often hear, again, a criticism of the way in which public schools are funded and the way in which people approach the issues in education. And they say, well, you can't just keep throwing money at the problem. You can't just keep spending more per student. It doesn't actually help. On the other hand, in the private sector, the idea of investing in your resources, investing in your employees, et cetera, is a well-known and accepted way of thinking.
Yes, it is. But you also have to remember that funding anything in the public sector these days is not very popular. Okay, we've come to believe that government is bad, or at least we've been led to believe that government is bad. And there really is a concerted movement to dismantle public education. So that's part of what these wars are about. And we're now in the age of Trump. We're in the era of alternative facts. Our democracy is in crisis. And I think this is a good time to remember that the founding fathers, John Adams in particular in Massachusetts, saw public education as vital to a educated citizenry in a democracy.
And yet it doesn't seem that we have stopped believing that the private sector is somehow going to come in, swoop in, and rescue or fix public education. You had only a few years ago Mark Zuckerberg trying to fix the Newark schools. That didn't work out very well. You now have many of the big tech companies coming in and kind of doing perhaps a more subtle takeover via, sort of infiltrating the school systems with their products. And is that any better than what came before?
Let's unpack some of this. Okay. So you've got Zuckerberg in Newark. And yes, that didn't work out so well. You've got New Orleans, where, they're touting like crazy these test scores. Well, they're elementary school test scores. Nobody mentions that it's just the elementary grades. They have yet to come out with a study on what's happening with high schools. And the Louisiana state auditor has repeatedly said that the dropout numbers published by the state of Louisiana are completely unreliable. So they are forcing out kids, okay? And one of the themes that you hear in both Newark and New Orleans and in many other parts of the country, including Los Angeles, where there's a real takeover happening, is that the business people, the philanthropists, the ed reformers aren't listening to local people. So even those people who are, for example, charter school supporters, okay, Shavar Jeffries in Newark, Howard Fuller, who had been the superintendent of schools in Milwaukee and is really an eminence grise also in New Orleans, they are all talking about the fact that wealthy, usually white reformers descend on these communities and they never actually talk to the people there, and it becomes a real problem. I mean,
it goes back to that trust in your people.
It goes back to trust. It goes back to who are the schools for? In New Orleans, 4,500 teachers, Black teachers for the most part, women teachers were fired. They brought in a bunch of young, inexperienced TFAers. And by the way, this brings us to a whole...
What's a TFAer?
I'm sorry.
Teach for America?
Teach for America.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
That's Wendy Kopp's organization.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, the plan that the Broad Foundation has just... I think the Los Angeles Times actually revealed their plan, also calls for Teach for America folks coming in as they expand charter schools in Los Angeles.
Can you explain what's going on in LA?
So what's going on in LA is the Broad Foundation, which has essentially taken over the school board. They just won a majority on the school board, wants to double the number of charter schools in Los Angeles, and they have a multi-million-dollar plan for doing it, including bringing in TFA, et cetera, which is a reprise of what happened in New Orleans. And there's a lot of unhappiness in New Orleans in the Black community around how that was done.
How in as progressive a state as California does this kind of takeover from the outside happen in the public school system?
It's a really good question. The best answer I can come up with is that Broad has made the submission, and he's gotten a lot of other very wealthy people behind him to do that.
Who is he?
Eli Broad. He's basically a property developer and insurance magnate who's also very powerful in the arts world in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And he is one, as I mentioned earlier, he's one of the three big funders of ed reform and charter schools in the country. And they've made this their mission. They've also bought education publications. They have established education publications, so they're beginning to really guide the message. And, one thing I just did want to come back to, which is, again, this whole idea of what are the differences between schools and businesses. Mm-hmm. There are 10 million kids, roughly, in K through 12 education, something like 3.5 million teachers. The scale of that is so much bigger than what you would see in any private organization, right? And yet what one hears all the time is, we just have to train, just have to get the best teachers, just getting a great teacher in every classroom. Well, of course, but, as I think Linda Darling-Hammond said, you can't fire your way to Finland, okay? Mm-hmm. Finland is held up as this model of fabulous education. To a great extent, you have to work with the educators that you've got. And in fact, one question I asked every ed reformer I spoke to, every principal, every superintendent, I said, what percentage of the teachers in your school, your district, your city are bad teachers? And I asked that question of Paul Vallis. I asked that question of the most well-regarded progressive educators in New York City. And I came back with the same answer from everybody, somewhere between 10 and 20%. Mm-hmm. The highest number of bad teachers anyone mentioned, including Paul Vallis, was 20%. We have an entire system that is geared toward weeding out the bottom, shall we say, 10 to 20%, mm-hmm. versus trying to nurture and bring along and make excellent the quote-unquote top 80%.
So you talked about
crazy.
Trusting the employees that you have. You talked earlier about small schools. Is there anything that the private sector, that business-like approach to education has brought to the public school system that actually works or makes sense?
Well, let me turn that question around, if I may. At the peak of the Debbie Meyer, Tony Alvarado small school movement in New York, the Annenberg Foundation, Walter Annenberg, came in and said, you know what, we're going to fund a big expansion or help fund a big expansion of these small schools. Mm-hmm. And for a brief moment, it looked as though the small school strategy was on the verge of literally taking over about 10% of the schools in New York City, which is an enormous number of schools. The mayors at the time were on board with this, the schools chancellors. There was a secretary of education in New York State who was on board with this. And then suddenly there was regime change. Giuliani and Pataki come in, all the education folks change. And that movement no longer takes place. However, the small schools movement doesn't go away. It actually continues and then, of course, is re-embraced by Bloomberg. So I think the interesting question to ask is, what if Bloomberg had brought, his very sharp business skills to this education problem, with a little more humility and sort of systems thinking and knowledge, say, of the systems thinkers like Deming, and said, well, help us understand how you did the good stuff in the city and how we can expand it. And there were a lot of ideas. The network structure, for example, which the Bloomberg administration started at the end of the Bloomberg years, was considered by the best educators in New York to be one of the smartest moves in years. Basically, they set up these small networks, and the idea was, and this is a big problem in public education, the idea was to wrest control of both money and supervision to a great extent from the bureaucracy and vest it in these small networks, which the schools would then choose who would be their networks and who would be their network leaders. And if they didn't like the way the networks and the network leaders were functioning, they would fire them. So they literally turned that reporting relationship on its head. And the best networks turned out to be very supportive of the schools that they were working with. And when de Blasio is elected, something like 150 principals got together and wrote a letter to de Blasio begging him to keep the network structure, and they got rid of it.
I was going to say, let's end with de Blasio and sort of what do you think of his approach? He has said that education is a priority. He's coming from a progressive ideology, and he has expanded education in the early years with the universal preschool. How's he doing?
Well, I think universal pre-K was great. But honestly, I've never seen such a pendulum swing. From my perspective, he and Carmen Farina, his first chancellor, basically dismantled everything that Bloomberg tried to do, whether it was good or bad. They even closed some of the best small schools. They got rid of the networks, which the best educators really thought very highly of. It's really pretty sad in my view, not because I think, and in fact, we've talked about the fact that I think Bloomberg made a lot of mistakes, but there were positives there. Mm-hmm. And the real question, I think, going forward is, how do you build on what works rather than just throwing out the baby with the bathwater?
All right, Andrea, I think the after in your title, After the Education Wars, is now sort of moved even further into the future. But thank you so much for being here. The book, again, is called After the Education Wars, How Smart Schools Upend the Business of Reform by Andrea Gabor. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, we have my colleagues John Williams and Tina Jordan, as well as a special guest star, A.O. Scott, one of our chief film critics here at the Times. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, Tony.
All right, let's start with you, Tina. What are you reading?
All right. So I'm reading something I feel like I should have already read. It's called Beautiful Animals by Lawrence Osborne. And he wrote a piece for us recently, and it made me realize, oh my gosh, I haven't read this book yet. And it's a psychological thriller set on the Greek island of Hydra. There are two young women in it. One, an heiress, a British, the daughter of an airline owner. One, a young, wealthy American. And they have discovered on their jaunts around the island a Syrian refugee who's obviously washed up in a boat somehow.
Oh, I'm now remembering our cover illustration for this. Yes.
Was it a cover?
It was a cover,
wow.
Yes.
Well,
Katie Kitamura reviewed it for us.
It deserves it. I just want to read the opening few lines to give you the taste. High up on the mountainside above the port, the Codringtons slept through the dry mornings in their villa, shaded by cypresses and by awnings rolled down over the doors. They lay in pajama-clad splendor among their Byzantine icons and paintings of Hydriot sea captains, unaware that their daughter Naomi had taken up early swims. It's got this languid, elegant feel to it, but there's threat and darkness just sort of thrumming beneath the surface on every page. And I'm to a point where Naomi and her friend, Samantha Sam, are trying to figure out how to help this refugee, and he needs money to get to the mainland. And Naomi has hit upon the brilliant idea that he should rob her father and stepmother in their villa because they have a lot of valuable crap lying around. They'll never miss it. She'll let him in. And I don't know what's about to happen, but it can't be good.
I read a short-ish novel of his called Ballad of a Small Player a few years ago because it's partly about gambling, which is a pet theme of mine.
Sub-interest.
In my nonfiction and fiction reading.
So you
It was
so
very
and
good.
you
It was
liked
very
it.
good, but it wasn't quite a thriller. This sounds like it's really gripping you.
It's gripping, and there's this strange symbiotic relationship between the two girls. I just want to read you one more line. There was something alarming about her, but it was just possible that Naomi herself had been a little bit altered, a little bit, by contact with Sam. There's the spinning top, and there's the girl who whips it into motion, but the two are merged in the same motion.
Excellent.
Yes.
Well, we don't have to talk about Ulysses this week because Greg is on vacation.
God.
And we're hoping he's not listening to this. So it will be a Ulysses-free week. And instead, we have Tony Scott here to talk about what he's reading.
Finnegan's Wake. No, just kidding.
Please.
For the third time. The book I've most recently started reading is Winter by Ali Smith, because the book I most recently finished reading is her Autumn. It's a sequence of books that she's been writing pegged to the seasons and very much kind of responding to, although in an oblique way, the public events in Britain and America. She's a Scottish writer. The previous book of hers I had read is a wonderful kind of strange hybrid essay novel called How to Be Both. And I was really taken with that, and had also been taken with Dwight Garner's championing of this sequence of books in Our Pages.
Sarah Lyle, also a fan.
Yeah, and I thought Autumn was just extraordinary. I mean, it's hard almost to say what it is or what it's about. It's about the friendship between a young girl and a very, very old man. It sort of unfolds at the moment of his death, and it goes back into their history together as neighbors, her relationship with her mother. There's an interesting kind of excursion into art history. And it's a novel that feels very of the moment and very kind of urgently political without saying anything.
People were saying it was like the first Brexit novel.
Yeah. And you can feel a sort of a sense of unsettlement and calamity and confusion and almost a whole kind of sense of cultural identity crisis suffusing all of the things that the characters are doing. But they don't really talk about it because it's also, I think, about how detached our own individual experiences can feel from the sequence of public events that we're always kind of aware of that sort of press on us without entirely becoming part of our daily lives or our consciousness.
As you're listening to Tony speak, I think you will realize that it's no surprise he is the author of Better Living Through Criticism, which I neglected to mention, his great book about the art of criticism. But talk to us a little bit about movie-related books.
Well, that's the burden sometimes. I mean, I seem to hit cycles where, and I'm in one now, so really what I've been reading in a frenzy in the last couple of weeks are two books that were the basis of movies that came out as we're speaking. One was Crazy Rich Asians
by Kevin Kwong.
The other was Juliet Naked by Nick Hornby. And there's an interesting contrast because I think that Crazy Rich Asians, and I'm not sure this is even a controversial thing to say, is a pretty bad book. I think even people who like it would maybe because it's just
it's like a good bad book.
It's like a milkshake. You just slurp it down.
Yes, it's just sort of breezy and trashy, and it's just like it's not very well written. Its plot is so loose and baggy and stuffed with things. But the movie winnows out the most interesting and appealing and seductive parts of it and makes it into a kind of refreshingly old-fashioned romantic comedy about young people's love for each other being opposed by the older generation and by this traditional society that they're part of.
Did the author do the screenplay adaptation himself?
No, I don't think that he did.
But Hornby must have.
No, Hornby actually, the writers on that were Evgenia Peretz, whose brother Jesse Peretz directed it, and Tamara Jenkins and Jim Taylor.
That's quite a crew.
No, it was a great crew. It's unfortunately not a very good movie. Actually, it's a very well-written movie, as it is a very well-written book. But somehow what I found to be a kind of soft and unconvincing sentimentality in the story that's there in the book, but kind of camouflaged under Hornby's wit really sort of came to the fore in the movie.
I have a question.
Yes.
So are you reading the book before you go to the movie?
It really depends. I don't have a set method. And sometimes I don't read the book at all, or sometimes I read part of it, or just sort of try to kind of acquaint myself with it or get a feel for it. Because you sort of don't want one to get in the way of the other. Ideally, you would see the movie first and then go back to the book as almost a fact-checking or
That's
research.
so interesting, because I feel so religiously, but maybe that's because of where I sit here, that you have to read the book first.
Same. And I always then end up at the movie with the experience of the book lodged in my head. And sometimes that's fine.
It can be hard. I mean, and in a way, sort of the better the book is, or the more you like it, the more likely you are to be disappointed. So, I mean, recently, back in the spring, there was an adaptation of Ian McEwan's On Chesil Beach. And it was a pretty good movie, but I think it's just a magnificent book. I think the book is like perfect to the letter, to the word. And the movie just isn't. He wrote the screenplay, and it's a very scrupulous and serious adaptation, but it just isn't quite the same.
I mean, as a book person, I feel like the movies that work for me that are adapted from books are the ones that make me think about the book in a different way, or make me focus on something I missed the first time around. I
think that's right. I think the best literary adaptations are kind of strong interpretations or even misreadings of books. I think that the ones that
I love that idea.
To me never kind of quite work are the ones that try to be scrupulously faithful and do everything that the book did and are kind of in awe of or cowed by the authority of the author and of the book. The more liberty they take, the more kind of irresponsible they allow themselves to be, the more interesting they are to as ways back into the book. I think that's true, for example, of Baz Luhrmann's Great Gatsby, which is a fascinating, kind of crazy interpretation of that book, but a very strong and confident one.
For me, it was Winter's Bone.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
Sorry. We're off topic here. John, what are you reading?
I think about 85% of the staff, I'm preparing to go on vacation next week. And so I'm doing a little bit of pre-vacation reading because I'm going to Spain. And so I read Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell, which I had never gotten to, which was, completely brilliant and kind of interesting about what it says about leftist politics. There's a lot of echoes about, how to organize and protest for today. And now I'm actually on a book that is Spain adjacent, which I found on Twitter. It's fashionable to trash Twitter and talk about how it's ruining all of our brains, but I actually love it, maybe only in the way that an addict loves his drug. But I get a lot of reading recommendations on there, and I follow a lot of smart people who...
Sometimes, do you have this thing of like, everyone on Twitter is talking about books, and then you realize, oh.
Right. The people I follow are talking about
books. But I agree with you. I get tons of book recommendations.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to make a little list of the books I've read because I found them on Twitter. And this is one of them. It's by an art critic, a British art critic named Laura Quammen, and it's called The Vanishing Velasquez, a 19th century bookseller's obsession with a lost masterpiece. And it's about a British bookseller in the Victorian era who comes across at an auction what he thinks is a Velasquez portrait of Charles I, England's Charles I, when he was a prince. And it's not clear that it's a Velasquez. People think it's a Van Dyck. And basically, it's the dual story of his life, how he tries to get it notarized, essentially, as a Velasquez. And Authenticated. Thank you, Tony. And then also the story of Velasquez and his paintings and Cummings' thoughts about him, which are very incisive. So she kind of shuttles back and forth, but in a very seamless way, between Velasquez's work and his life, and then this man whose name is John Snare, great name, and his life with this painting. And I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, and I would highly recommend it.
Does this mean you've left Japan?
I would also highly recommend Twitter. I have not left Japan, no, but I'm going to be in Spain for about 9 days. When I come back, I think the fall, I will start threading the Japanese novels back into
What else is on your Spanish reading list?
I'm going to bring with me 2 books about Barcelona in particular, Colm Tobin's sort of thin one called Homage to Barcelona, and a much heftier one by Robert Hughes, the art critic. This is ambitious, I realize. I'm bringing Adam Hochschild's book about the Americans in the Spanish Civil War, their involvement with it, and I'm bringing a novel called Nada, N-A-D-A, and unfortunately I'm going to forget the author's name right now, but it was recommended by a colleague here very highly. So those are the 4 that are packed as of now. You're going away as well, but we'll skip that and we'll get to what you're reading.
Well, I just finished reading Edith Wharton's A Backward Glance, her autobiography, and I cannot recommend it highly enough. Tina Jordan across from me is smiling because I've told her I would loan her my copy after I talked about it today. I mean, there's so many great things about it. The evocation of the era. For me, it was interesting. Her discussion of life at the Mount in Massachusetts, having just visited there, but also about sort of the state of rural Massachusetts life at the time and her efforts to capture it in two novels, Summer and, of course, in Ethan Frome. And then just great passages about Henry James, about the way he spoke, about it's actually some things are very comforting about this book as a reader and a writer. One thing is that she says that she has a terrible memory for conversation. So she repeatedly says, just trust me, like Henry James was this incredible wit and storyteller, but I don't remember really anything that he said, which I find soothing. And then she also, her joy at the reception of her first novels and of finding people who read her is just amazing. There's this one episode, and then her shyness at meeting fellow writers. And there's this one episode that combines both of those two things. There's this anecdote she shares where Henry James is trying to persuade her to visit a writer, George Meredith. Do you guys know who George Meredith is?
Sort of by I mean, he's sort of this big Victorian or late Victorian writer who nobody reads anymore.
That's right. Yeah. Yes. In fact, I went on to a couple of websites to look for his books, and only one is really in print in a Penguin Classics that I think was printed in the 80s or 90s. So it's so interesting because at the time they're both like the great George Meredith. She is so in awe. She says, I cannot go in there. I cannot meet him. I'm going to be shy. I won't know what to say. And she drags her feet. But Henry James persuades her to go in. And when they walk in, George Meredith is reading her novel, which is just this amazing scene. But I think my favorite encounter in the book is where she recounts a meeting with Theodore Roosevelt, who is a very distant by marriage relation of hers and who she had known since she was a child. But I'll read this portion. It begins with a quote. Well, I am glad to welcome to the White House someone to whom I can quote The Hunting of the Snark without being asked what I mean. Such was my first greeting from Theodore Roosevelt after his accession to the presidency. She goes on to talk about it a little bit, and then later on she quotes him again. Would you believe it, he added, no one in the administration has ever heard of Alice, much less of the Snark. And the other day, when I said to the Secretary of the Navy, Mr. Secretary, what I say 3 times is true, he did not recognize the allusion and answered with an aggrieved air, Mr. President, it would never for a moment have occurred to me to impugn your veracity. And, the nice thing about this is I'm actually reading through the looking glass right now aloud to my youngest child. So there's this nice sort of concurrence in both of the books that I'm reading at the moment.
Well, I've been very glad the last couple of weeks that you've been reading this aloud to us. Very charming.
Well, I will pass it on to Tina, and then she will then pass it on to you. All right, Tony, Tina, John, thanks so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.